What if I told you that everything you believed in while watching beautiful costume dramas is not true? Behind the magnificent facades of Victorian mansions, where order and prosperity seem to reign, lay a dark and ruthless machine for processing human destinies. We are used to seeing elegant footmen and neat maids smiling as they serve tea on silver trays. But the reality was far from the romantic images of cinema and romance novels of the time. It was a world where people voluntarily sold their freedom for a roof over their heads and meager food, becoming invisible in their own homes. Their lives were subject to the strictest rules, the violation of which threatened not only dismissal, but complete social ruin. Watch the video to the end to find out how the system turned living people into silent functions, and what a terrible price the servants paid for the empire's outward splendor. Are you ready to learn the truth about how people were taught to disappear while in a room? In a Victorian home, the main virtue of a servant was not so much their ability to work, but their ability to be completely invisible to their masters. This required not just physical dexterity, but a complete psychological reorientation of the personality, which began on the first day of service. Servants were forbidden to speak to their masters first, unless they were asked a direct question or given an order. Even in narrow corridors, if a maid encountered a gentleman, she was obliged to press herself against the wall and turn away, pretending that she did not exist. This was not just a rule of etiquette, but harsh training aimed at erasing the human eye. The architecture of the houses was specifically designed to separate the worlds of masters and servants with impenetrable barriers. There were separate staircases, hidden doors, and secret corridors through which the staff moved like shadows in a labyrinth. The green upholstery on the doors of the service rooms served not only as sound insulation, but also as a marker of a boundary that could not be crossed without permission. Life was bustling behind the walls, but only perfectly trained mechanisms in human form were allowed into the reception rooms. Any extraneous sound, whether laughter, loud conversation, or the clang of a bucket, was punished with a stern reprimand or a fine. The psychological pressure was intensified by the requirement to suppress any natural emotions and physical needs in the presence of the masters. A servant was not allowed to sneeze, cough, or show fatigue, even if he had been on his feet for 18 hours. If a maid had a family tragedy, she had to go to work with dry eyes and an impassive face. Personal experiences were considered an unacceptable luxury that could disturb the peace of the inhabitants of the upper floors. A person was turned into a function, a set of useful actions, devoid of soul and nerves. This art of invisibility was especially difficult for young girls who had just arrived from the countryside. They had to break their habits, learn to move silently like cats, and wear clothes that did not rustle. The squeak of shoes could cause a serious scandal and accusations of unprofessionalism. Special lessons in gait and manners were part of the training, but the teachers were not governesses, but strict housekeepers. Every movement was honed to perfection, so that the presence of a servant was felt only through the result of his labor. Invisibility also extended to the servant's personal belongings, which were not to be seen by the owners. A discarded bucket, a forgotten rag, or a brush were perceived as an insult to the aesthetic sensibilities of the owners of the house. Cleaning was carried out at strictly designated times when the owners were still asleep or away from home on visits. If the schedule was disrupted, the servants had to hide in alcoves or utility rooms, waiting for their masters to pass by. This created an atmosphere of constant tension and fear of being discovered at the wrong moment. Even the names of the servants were often erased and replaced with nicknames that were more familiar or convenient for the owners. All the footmen could be called John or James, regardless of what their parents had christened them. This further depersonalized the staff, turning them into interchangeable parts of one large mechanism. Individuality was considered a flaw, while standardization was considered the highest good and a sign of good taste. People lost not only their freedom of action, but also their own names, becoming part of the inventory. Interaction between the servants themselves was also regulated by rules of invisibility and silence. Loud conversations in the kitchen or in the servants' quarters could be heard upstairs through ventilation shafts or floors. Therefore, communication was often reduced to whispers or signs, creating an oppressive atmosphere of conspiracy. Laughter and singing were strictly forbidden, as they could destroy the illusion that the house ran itself. The highest skill was considered to be the ability to anticipate the wishes of the owners before they were even voiced. The ideal servant would serve a glass of water a second before the master felt thirsty. This required constant, intense observation of the habits and moods of their employers. Servants became subtle psychologists by necessity, studying the slightest changes in their owners' facial expressions and gestures. But this knowledge was used not for closeness, but for survival in the system. The irony was that the servants knew absolutely everything about their masters, while remaining complete strangers to them. They saw them in moments of weakness, knew their secrets, illnesses, and vices. But this wealth of information was useless, as any hint of awareness could cost them their jobs. Silence was golden, and invisibility was the only form of protection available. This system created a paradoxical situation of loneliness in a crowded house. A person was surrounded by people but had no right to full human communication with either the upper classes or, often, the lower classes. The feeling of isolation and alienation became a constant companion in life in a wealthy mansion. Invisibility became ingrained, and even after leaving service, former servants often retained the habit of being inconspicuous. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. What do you think about completely erasing your personality for the sake of work? Let me know in the comments. Guess how long it took to create this illusory sense of ease of being? The working day of a Victorian servant was a marathon of survival that lasted an average of 17 hours. The day began long before dawn for junior staff, especially kitchen and dishwashing workers, often at 5 in the morning. The first task was to light the huge coal stoves and fireplaces so that the house would be warm when the masters woke up. It was dirty, hard work in cold and dark rooms, requiring physical strength and skill. Unlike factory workers, domestic servants did not have clearly regulated shifts or days off. Their time belonged entirely to their employer, and they had to be available at any time of the day or night. The concept of free time was purely nominal and was often spent mending their own clothes or praying. Even a short break for a meal could be interrupted by the ringing of a bell, demanding immediate attention. Life was governed by the rhythm of bells, each with its own tone and meaning. Cleaning huge mansions filled with carpets, curtains, and knickknacks was a Sisyphean task. Dust from coal fireplaces and gas lighting settled everywhere in a thick layer every day. Maids had to clean carpets on their knees with brushes, as vacuum cleaners did not yet exist. It was a monotonous, exhausting strain on the back and joints, which over time led to chronic pain. Every room required thorough cleaning, and the slightest oversight was noticed by the housekeeper's discerning eye. A special place in the schedule was reserved for preparing for meals, which turned into a complex logistical operation. Setting the table, polishing silver, preparing glassware, all this required hours of painstaking work. After lunch, there was an endless series of washing dishes, often in ice-cold water with the use of caustic agents. The dishwasher's hands never dried out, and her skin cracked and roughened from constant contact with grease and alkali. And all this happened at a frantic pace in order to be ready for the next meal. A good night's sleep was also not guaranteed, especially for footmen and valets who waited for their masters to return from balls. They had to stay awake until late at night to open the door, help them undress, and prepare night tea. Sleep was often limited to 5 or 6 hours, after which the cycle began again. Chronic sleep deprivation was the norm, and servants learned to sleep in fits and starts, standing or sitting in uncomfortable positions. This state of constant fatigue dulled the senses and turned people into zombies. Sunday, which was theoretically considered a day of rest and church attendance, was often busy with work and practice. The owners hosted Sunday dinners, which required even more effort in the kitchen and dining room. Going to church was the only opportunity to leave the house. But even there, the servants sat separately. A full day off was extremely rare, sometimes once a month, and often came with a host of conditions. Time in the house flowed differently. It was measured not by the clock, but by the tasks performed and the whims of the owners. Waiting for orders was as much a part of the job as carrying them out, and this waiting was no less exhausting. Sitting in the hallway or pantry for hours, without the right to read or do one's own business, was psychological torture. A person became an interior decoration, ready to come to life at the first request. The lack of a clear division between the workplace and home created a feeling of being trapped. The servant never left the office. He slept, ate, and lived on his employer's property. This deprived him of the psychological relief and change of scenery necessary for mental recovery. The walls of the house were oppressive, creating the feeling of a prison sentence for life. Every hour was scheduled down to the minute, and any deviation from the schedule was considered sabotage or laziness. Housekeepers and butlers monitored the timetable with fanatical strictness, punishing the slightest delay. Life turned into an endless race against the clock, which was impossible to win. And in this race, youth, health, and hopes for a better future were burned away. But the most frightening secret lay not in the hours they worked, but in what exactly they had to work with every day. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of cleanliness? What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries in the modern world. But back then, it was the norm. The struggle for perfect cleanliness in a Victorian home was a veritable chemical war, with the lungs and skin of servants as the main victims. The cleaning products used back then would horrify any health and safety commission today. The famous shine of Victorian interiors was achieved at the cost of inhaling poisonous fumes and constant contact with toxic substances. Graphite and sulfuric acid-based compounds were used to clean fireplace grates so that they would shine black. This mixture had to be rubbed in by hand, often without gloves, inhaling acrid dust. Black lead, which was part of many polishes, accumulated in the body, causing slow poisoning. Maids who worked on fireplaces were covered in black soot by the end of the day, which ate into their pores. Washing off this dirt was a feat in itself, requiring stiff brushes and even more caustic soap. Polishing furniture and floors required the use of beeswax mixed with turpentine. Turpentine fumes in closed, poorly ventilated rooms caused dizziness, nausea, and headaches. To achieve a mirror-like shine, surfaces had to be rubbed with tremendous force, kneeling for hours. This smell, a mixture of wax and solvent, became the smell of the servants' very lives, haunting them even in their dreams. Laundry was perhaps the most dangerous chemical process in the house. Strong alkalis, soda, and bleach were used to achieve the sparkling whiteness of sheets and tablecloths. The vapors of the boiling alkaline solution corroded the mucous membranes of the laundresses' eyes and throats. Hands, constantly immersed in a hot, aggressive environment, were covered with chemical burns, and the skin became thin and parchment-like. No creams or protective equipment were provided. This was considered an occupational hazard. Compounds containing oxalic acid and ammonia were used to clean copper utensils and door handles. The pungent smell of ammonia hung in the pantries and kitchens, making eyes water. Copper required daily polishing, as it quickly tarnished from coal smoke and gaslighting. It was a never-ending battle against oxidation, fought with poisonous rags as weapons. The so-called dry cleaning of carpets and upholstered furniture was particularly dangerous. Powders containing arsenic and other heavy metals were used to combat moths and brighten colors. When these carpets were beaten, toxic dust rose into the air, and servants inhaled it into their lungs. Chronic coughing and breathing problems were occupational diseases among maids. Even insects were controlled with deadly poisons scattered around the corners of kitchens and pantries. Rat poison and cockroach powders could get on food or clothing if care was not taken. Servants lived surrounded by toxic traps, responsible for the safety of their master's food. Mirrors and glass were cleaned with alcohol and chalk, but mercury was used in the production of mirrors at that time. Old mirrors could evaporate microdoses of toxins, especially in warm rooms. Although this effect was slow, it contributed to the overall picture of poor health. The whole house was saturated with invisible enemies. Cleanliness in the Victorian era did not smell of freshness, but of chemicals and hard work. Behind the glitter of chandeliers and the whiteness of cuffs lay the daily intoxication of those who created this splendor. It was the price of prestige paid with the health of those at the bottom of the food chain. Like this if you've never thought about how harmful regular cleaning was to health in the past. Are you ready for the shocking truth that the main oppressors of servants were not their masters? The hierarchy of the lower world was tougher and more ruthless than the class differences in high society. At the top of this pyramid were the butler and the housekeeper, whose power over the junior staff was virtually unlimited. For a young dishwasher or novice footman, these figures were more frightening than the distant and unapproachable master of the house. They decided fates, handed out punishments, and determined every step of their subordinates with the meticulousness of prison guards. The butler was the king of the male staff and the keeper of the wine cellar. He sat at the head of the table in the servants' quarters, and no one dared to start eating before him or speak without his permission. His word was law, and any argument was considered rebellion, punishable by dismissal. He demanded the same respect that the servants showed their masters, copying their manners and arrogance. Often it was the butlers who became the most cruel tyrants, taking out their own humiliations on their subordinates. The housekeeper, or mistress, even if she was not married, ruled the female half of the house with an iron fist. A bunch of keys to the storerooms always jingled on her belt, a symbol of her power and control over resources. She checked the cleanliness with a white glove, looked into the farthest corners, and mercilessly fined for the slightest speck of dust. Everyone sought her approval and feared her wrath, as she could throw a girl out onto the street without a reference. There was a gulf between the senior and junior servants that was almost impossible to bridge. The senior servants had their privileges, a separate dining room, the housekeeper's room, better food, and the right to rest. The junior servants slept in shared rooms, ate leftovers, and did the dirtiest work. This internal caste system gave rise to envy, denunciations, and intrigues that poisoned the atmosphere in the collective. Hazing was commonplace. Newcomers were ridiculed and bullied by the old-timers. They were given meaningless tasks, forced to do other people's work, or set up in front of their superiors. There was no one to complain to, as the owners never interfered in personnel management. Those who survived were those who knew how to endure, keep quiet, and adapt to the cruel rules of the game. The strict observance of subordination reached absurd levels. A junior maid was not allowed to address a senior maid directly in the presence of others without her permission. There was a complex etiquette of bowing, giving way, and addressing others, the violation of which was considered rude. This system kept people in constant tension, forcing them to watch their every word and gesture. Senior servants often abused their position, appropriating part of the money allocated for the household or gifts from guests. The younger servants saw this but were forced to remain silent, becoming unwilling accomplices. A circle of mutual responsibility bound all the inhabitants of the servants' quarters with invisible chains of fear and dependence. It was especially hard for the so-called tweenies, the maids who ran errands and were at the bottom of the hierarchy. Everyone from the cook to the senior maid bossed them around, sending them on errands from morning till night. They had no defenders, no status, and often not even a place to call their own. They were slaves to slaves, creatures whose opinions and fatigue were of no interest to anyone. This internal tyranny was convenient for the masters, as it maintained discipline more effectively than any external measures. Divide and rule. This principle worked flawlessly in the Victorian home. The servants were too busy fighting for survival and status within their own circle to unite against the system. Why do you think people in the same powerless position treated each other so cruelly? A servant's clothing was not just a work uniform, but a symbol of their complete renunciation of their own individuality. Strict regulations determined every detail of their wardrobe, from the color of their stockings to the shape of their bonnet. Personal preferences, comfort, or taste were irrelevant. A person became a clothes hanger for a livery or apron. The uniform served as a status marker, clearly indicating a person's place in the household hierarchy and separating them from the world of free people. For maids, the morning began with putting on a print dress made of cheap cotton for dirty work. This dress was stiff, uncomfortable, and often cold, but it had to be worn until lunchtime. In the afternoon, they had to change into a black wool dress with a white apron and a cap. This endless changing of clothes took away precious minutes of rest, but it was a mandatory ritual. Black was mournful, practical, and faceless, turning women into identical dark silhouettes. Footmen suffered even more from their liveries, as their costumes were often tailored in the fashion of the previous century. Powdered wigs, silk stockings, short breeches. All of this looked theatrical and was extremely impractical in a cold English house. They froze in thin silk, afraid to wear warm underwear underneath that might be visible. The livery was the property of the master, was expensive, and for any stain or hole, huge sums were deducted from the servant's salary. The care of the uniform fell on the shoulders of the servants themselves and was often done at the expense of their sleep. Washing starched collars, cuffs, and aprons required time and effort. Everything had to be perfectly white and stiff. The slightest yellowing or creasing was unacceptable. Maids stood with irons at night, tidying up their face so that they could appear before the housekeeper in the morning looking impeccable. Footwear was a separate torture. Servants were required to wear thin shoes with leather soles so as not to make noise. These shoes provided no support for the feet and quickly became wet on the stone floors of the kitchen. By the end of the day, their feet were swollen and burning, but changing into more comfortable shoes was strictly forbidden. Limping or shuffling was punished because it spoiled the aesthetics of movement. Servants were forbidden to wear jewelry, use cosmetics, or have fashionable hairstyles. Any display of coquetry or desire to adorn oneself was considered vulgar and indecent. Girls with luxurious hair were required to hide it under strict bonnets, concealing their beauty. This was a violent depersonalization designed to suppress any display of sexuality or attractiveness. The purchase of certain uniform items, such as stockings, shoes, or underwear, was often paid for by the servant themselves. With meager wages, this became a serious financial burden. People went into debt to buy new shoes needed for work, falling into even greater dependence. The system was set up so that you paid for the right to work. Even when going out on their rare days off, many servants were required to wear elements of their uniform or clothing that revealed their status. This made them vulnerable to ridicule from street urchins and cut them off from society. They could not blend in with the crowd or feel like ordinary townspeople. The mark of a servant was always on them, visible to everyone they met. The uniform restricted their movements, made it difficult to breathe, and was a constant reminder of their bondage. Stiff corsets for women, tight collars for men. Their bodies were encased in armor of obedience. They could only take off these clothes late at night, and this moment was their only taste of physical freedom in a day. Clothing shaped consciousness, accustoming the body to obedience and discipline. There was no escape from the uniform. It became a second skin that could not be shed. But while clothing provided at least some protection from the outside world, there was no protection from the cold inside the house. Are you ready to find out where those who provided warmth and comfort to their masters slept? What if I showed you a time machine that would take us to an icy hell? Victorian mansions were famous for their drafts, but while the master's rooms had roaring fireplaces, the servants' quarters were a realm of eternal frost. Architects designed houses so that heat rose to the top and cold sank to the bottom, into basements and kitchens, or stagnated in attics. Servants' rooms were often located under the roof, where the walls froze in winter, or in damp semi-basements. The attic rooms where the maids lived usually had no heating at all. The thin partitions did not retain heat, and icy winds blew through the cracks in the tiles, bringing snow with them. The water in the jugs for washing turned to ice overnight, and in the morning it had to be broken up in order to wash. The girls slept covered with everything they had, huddling together to retain at least a little warmth. Getting out of bed in the morning into a freezing room was a daily physical ordeal. The dampness was even worse than the cold, especially in the basement rooms where the servants and kitchen staff lived. The walls there were often covered with mold, and the laundry never dried completely. This damp, musty air penetrated the lungs, causing rheumatism, bronchitis, and tuberculosis. Young men and women began to suffer from joint diseases that usually affect the elderly. The windows in the servants' rooms were often small, high up, or faced courtyards, depriving people of sunlight. The constant gloom contributed to depression and poor eyesight. Saving on candles and gas for servants was the norm, so they spent their evenings in darkness or by the dim light of stubs. This intensified their sense of isolation from the world and hopelessness. The contrast between the heat of the kitchen and the icy cold of the corridors and staircases was deadly to health. Cooks and dishwashers, steamed by the stoves, ran out into cold storerooms or courtyards, getting pneumonia. The body, exhausted by temperature changes, quickly gave up. There was no health insurance, and illness meant a loss of income and often a loss of employment. Bathrooms for servants were an unheard of luxury. They had to wash in basins, bringing water with them. In cold conditions, proper hygiene became a feat that they did not always have the strength to accomplish. This led to skin diseases and general discomfort, which had to be hidden. Dirt and cold went hand in hand, creating an environment of humiliation. The furniture in the servants' rooms consisted of discarded junk, hard beds with straw mattresses, and rickety chairs. There was no comfort, no carpets, only bare functionality. This emphasized the temporary and insignificant nature of their existence in the house. They had no space of their own that could be called home. The lack of ventilation in the attics in summer turned them into sweat boxes. The hot roof heated the air to unbearable temperatures, and the servants suffocated from the heat after a hard day's work. The house was a trap. In winter, it froze them. In summer, it suffocated them. Comfort was a privilege for which they paid with their health. Even blankets were rationed and were thin and scratchy. Asking for an extra blanket was considered impudent and a sign of pampering. Hardening through cold was considered beneficial for the morality of the lower classes. The masters sincerely believed that servants felt cold differently than they did, that their skin was rougher and less sensitive. This cold penetrated their souls, making people withdrawn and harsh. In the next chapter, you will learn how they coped with this terrible cold on a meager diet. The food served to servants in wealthy homes was a separate issue, full of myths and harsh realities. On the one hand, they did not starve like the poor in the slums, but their diet was monotonous, meager, and often humiliating. The basis of their diet was the leftovers from the master's table, which were sent downstairs after dinner. What the guests did not finish became a feast for the staff, but by the time these delicacies reached the junior servants, they had turned into an unappetizing mush. The hierarchy was observed here as well. The best pieces went to the top, while the lower ranks had to be content with bread and porridge. Bread, cheese, boiled lamb, and potatoes were the standard daily menu for the servants. Vegetables and fruits were rare, as they were considered an expensive luxury. The lack of vitamins affected the complexion, the condition of the teeth, and overall immunity. Scurvy and anemia were frequent companions of young girls working in the kitchen cellars. Outward satiety hid a deep deficiency of nutrients. The main drink was the so-called small beer, a weak alcoholic beverage that was drunk instead of water, which was often unsafe. Tea, a symbol of English comfort, was of poor quality for servants, either stale or rebrewed. Sugar was rationed, and stealing it was considered a serious offense. Even in food, servants were reminded of their inferiority. Mealtimes were strictly limited, often to just 20 minutes for lunch. They had to eat in silence or under strict supervision, quickly swallowing their food. Normal digestion was impossible in conditions of constant stress and readiness to jump at the call. Stomach ailments were a professional disease of footmen and maids. Often, the owners allocated a certain amount of money for the servants' food, board wages, with which the housekeeper bought provisions. Housekeepers, wanting to curry favor or pocket the difference, bought the cheapest, sometimes spoiled products. Meat could be tough, butter rancid, and flour infested with bugs. Complaining was dangerous, as it could be perceived as rebellion. In some houses, it was customary to lock food away. Tea, sugar, butter, and spices were kept by the housekeeper and issued in portions against signature. This created an atmosphere of mistrust, where every sugar cube was counted. Adults were forced to beg for food like children or beggars. The lack of hot meals during the day was also a problem. Breakfast was early and dinner was late after the owners had finished their meal. All day long, the servants made do with pieces of cold bread, sustaining themselves only with tea. A hungry rumbling in the stomach while serving the table was a terrible embarrassment. Sweets, pastries, and desserts were strictly forbidden unless they were spoiled or given away directly. Stealing food was one of the most common crimes, for which one was fired instantly. The temptation was great. Carrying trays of fragrant dishes and remaining hungry required tremendous willpower. Food was fuel for work, not pleasure. There was no variety, taste, or joy in it. It was simply a calorie-rich mass necessary to keep the legs walking and the hands washing. The attitude toward food reflected the attitude toward people, the minimum cost to maintain functionality. The life of a servant was a life in a veritable golden cage, where social isolation reached absurd proportions and broke the psyche. The most cruel and hated rule was the strictest ban on so-called visitors from outside, whether friends or suitors. Maids and footmen were strictly forbidden to invite anyone into the house, even if they were their closest relatives or parents. The owners were terrified that outsiders might steal something or distract the servants from their direct duties. The doors of the luxurious mansion were tightly closed to the private lives of those who kept it in order. Meetings with family were only possible on rare weekends, which occurred once a month or even less frequently. Such a schedule effectively severed all emotional ties with relatives, turning loved ones into distant acquaintances. Servants gradually became strangers in their own homes, missing weddings, funerals, and the births of nephews and nieces. A person found himself forcibly torn from his familiar social circle and locked in a strange world with strange rules. Over time, the only reality for him became the walls of his master's house, and the outside world turned into a blurred memory. Romantic relationships and affairs between servants within the house were strictly prohibited and considered a serious offense. If the butler or housekeeper noticed that a maid and a footman were beginning to show affection for each other, their fate was sealed. As a rule, both were dismissed without references so that, as the owners said, debauchery and moral decline in the house could be avoided. Employers were sincerely convinced that any feelings and personal life only distracted from polishing silver or cleaning carpets. Love was considered an unaffordable luxury, available only to the upper class. Letters addressed to servants were often subject to strict censorship or even opened by the employers before being delivered to the addressee. The lady of the house could calmly open the envelope to check whether the maid was writing to any undesirable suitors. Control over correspondence was hypocritically explained as concern for the morality of those under their care. But in reality, it was a form of total and humiliating surveillance. Servants did not even have the right to their own thoughts and feelings expressed on paper, as they could become public knowledge. Everyday trifles, such as a neighbor's loud snoring, unpleasant smells, or other people's habits, became a source of constant and exhausting irritation. People accumulated anger towards each other, but could not leave, being bound by contract and the need to survive. Forced proximity in such conditions almost never gave rise to genuine friendship or affection. On the contrary, it often bred quiet hatred and a desire to betray one's neighbor in order to curry favor with one's superiors. Moreover, servants were often forbidden to read openly so that, in the words of their masters, they would not fill their heads with nonsense. Education and enlightenment were considered harmful to the lower classes, as knowledge could sow the seeds of discontent with their situation. The masters needed obedient executors, not thinking individuals with their own opinions. As a result, people's horizons narrowed to the size of a single house, and all conversations boiled down to endless gossip about the lives of the masters. In church, they were only allowed to sit in specially designated places, often in the gallery or in the back rows. Faith became just another work duty, a boring part of the schedule, completely devoid of spiritual freedom. Even prayer was regulated, and sermons were often chosen to remind servants of the importance of humility. Priests instilled in them that serving their earthly masters was the path to salvation, reinforcing social inequality with the Word of God. The inability to start their own families led to painful psychological deformities. Servants, especially women, became deeply attached to their masters' children, giving them all their unspent maternal affection. Nannies and governesses loved their charges as their own, spending days and nights with them while their real parents were busy with social life. Pets also often became objects of love, replacing friends and children for servants. Fear of the outside world was deliberately and methodically cultivated by the masters. The masters constantly instilled in the servants that outside the secure gates of their mansion, only hunger, poverty, and vice awaited them. Dismissal was presented as a death sentence, as a fall to the very bottom of the social ladder, from which there was no return. People were intimidated with stories of workhouses and vagrancy so that they would appreciate their place. Everyone was on their own in this fierce struggle for a place under the sun in the favor of their masters. The hierarchical system deliberately broke down human connections, dividing servants into ranks and castes that were hostile to each other. All that remained was a rigid vertical chain of command with no room for horizontal connections or support. People lived their lives in crowded houses, but died in complete emotional isolation, never having found a kindred spirit. Victorian comfort weighed tons, and that weight was carried on the shoulders and backs of servants. Houses lacked running water on the upper floors and central heating, so water and coal had to be delivered by hand. Every day, maids carried dozens of heavy buckets of coal up to the third or fourth floor. The coal boxes weighed a lot, and the narrow spiral staircases made the climb dangerous and exhausting. It was an endless conveyor belt of fuel, without which the house would instantly cool down. Hot water for the owner's baths was another ordeal. Huge copper jugs of boiling water had to be carried from the bottom to the top, trying not to spill or burn oneself. The bath required many such trips. After the masters had washed, the dirty water had to be scooped out and carried downstairs. This exercise was repeated daily, turning the girls' arms and backs into taut tendons. The trays with food for breakfast in bed or lunch in the rooms were huge and heavy. Silverware, porcelain, lids, all of this weighed a lot. The footmen balanced these trays on the stairs, risking dropping the precious cargo. The physical strain was compounded by the fear of breaking expensive property, the cost of which exceeded their annual earnings. Washing and wringing out laundry by hand required the strength of a weightlifter. Wet sheets, heavy woolen blankets, all of this had to be turned, rubbed, and twisted. Washerwomen suffered from hernias and internal organ prolapse due to constant heavy lifting. Their work was one of the most physically demanding, comparable to that of a dock worker. Moving furniture for cleaning or preparing the ballroom was also the responsibility of the servants. Massive oak tables, chairs, carpets, all of this was moved by hand. Footmen often injured their backs, but complaining about pain was not acceptable. An injury meant unfitness for work and therefore dismissal. Even opening massive entrance doors and gates required effort. In large mansions, the doors were tall, heavy, and made of oak. The doorman or footman performed this movement hundreds of times a day, letting guests in and out. The monotonous physical exertion wore down the joints imperceptibly but surely. The lack of mechanization was compensated for by the number of people. Where today one elevator or pump would suffice, 5 servants worked. Human power was cheaper than machinery. The bodies of servants were used as expendable material, a resource that no one cared about. Carrying guests' luggage, huge trunks and chests, up the stairs was the duty of the footman. There were no wheels on suitcases back then. Meeting guests turned into a strength training session, which had to be performed with a smile and ease, without showing breathlessness. By the time they reached old age, which came early for servants at around 40 or 50, many were physically broken. Crooked fingers, sore backs, varicose veins. These were the legacy of many years of labor as a human elevator. They sacrificed their health so that their masters would not have to bother themselves with even lifting a glass. The most powerful lever for controlling servants was not the whip or fines, but the fear of dismissal without a reference. In Victorian England, character was a passport to life. If a servant was dismissed for misconduct, theft, or simply on a whim of the master without a written reference, he was effectively given a wolf ticket. No respectable household would hire someone without a good reference from their previous employer. This meant an instant fall to the bottom of society. Losing one's job meant losing one's housing and food on the same day. Servants rarely had savings, and finding themselves on the street with a suitcase of belongings was tantamount to disaster. For women, this often meant a path to prostitution. For men, to vagrancy or crime. The specter of the workhouse, a place feared more than death, always loomed over every servant. The masters knew about this fear and took advantage of it. The threat of leaving without a recommendation forced servants to endure any humiliation, harassment, and injustice. It was absolute power based on the ability to destroy a person's future with a stroke of the pen or refusal to do so. Servants were hostages to their master's moods. Dismissal could occur for the most ridiculous reasons. A broken vase, a cheeky reply, pregnancy, even by the master, or simply old age. When a servant became too old or sick to work effectively, they were often discarded like a broken chair. Loyalty and years of service did not guarantee a secure old age. Pensions were rare and depended entirely on the goodwill of the master. The recommendation system created a vicious circle. If you complained about conditions or left on your own because of mistreatment, your master could write a bad reference out of revenge. Servants were obliged to lie, flatter, and hypocrite in order to keep their reputation clean. The truth was a dangerous commodity that no one could afford. Women were particularly vulnerable. If a maid was seduced by her employer or his son and it was discovered, she was always found guilty. She was dismissed in disgrace, without character, while the gentleman went unpunished. A girl's tarnished reputation put an end to her career and chances of marriage. Even death did not always free them from their obligations. Servants often feared dying without leaving money for their own funerals, lest they be buried in a common grave for the poor. Funeral clubs, where they saved pennies, were popular among the staff. A decent funeral was the last dream and goal of their lives. Dependence on the employer was total. A servant was not a citizen in the full sense of the word. He was an appendage to the house. He had no union, no laws to protect his rights. He was alone against a system that could crush him at any moment. This sword of Damocles hung over their heads constantly, not allowing them to relax for a second. The fear of losing everything forced people to work themselves to exhaustion, endure pain, and smile through their tears. It was a perfect system of coercion, where the fear of starvation itself acted as the overseer. We saw the underside of a glorious era, a mechanism lubricated with the sweat and blood of invisible people. The Victorian house was not just a dwelling, but a complex factory serving the comfort of the chosen few, fueled by human lives. Behind every perfectly polished shoe, behind every snow-white tablecloth, there was a story of deprivation, pain, and titanic labor. These people gave up their names, their freedom, and their health in order to become perfect shadows. Their tragedy was not in loud disasters, but in the quiet daily death of their hopes and personalities. What echoes of this system do you think we can see in modern corporate culture or the service industry? Write in the comments what topics you would like to see in future videos. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new investigations into the dark pages of history.